May 10, 1996. Before dawn, climbers began leaving Camp 4 at the South Col on Mount Everest, moving into the death zone, where oxygen levels drop below what the human body can sustain for long periods. And from the first steps upward, the mountain was already showing the conditions that would define the disaster, not through avalanches or visible collapses, but through congestion, slow movement, and unstable weather patterns. That season, Everest was no longer only a mountaineering challenge, but a commercial objective, with multiple guided expeditions operating simultaneously on the same narrow route, sharing fixed ropes, oxygen caches, and camps, and relying on a limited weather window that created pressure on every decision. Two of the main commercial expeditions that morning were Adventure Consultants, led by Rob Hall, and Mountain Madness, led by Scott Fisher, along with several independent climbers and smaller teams, all converging on the same ascent line through the Khumbu Icefall, the Western Khum, the Lhotse Face, and the Southeast Ridge. In the weeks before summit day, climbers had followed the standard acclimatization process, rotating between lower camps and higher elevations to adapt their bodies to altitude, hypoxia, and cold, slowly staging supplies and oxygen bottles at camps 1, 2, 3, and 4. And by early May, most clients and guides were positioned at Camp 4, approximately 7,900 meters above sea level, an environment where the human body deteriorates even at rest. The summit plan was based on a strict structure. Leave Camp 4 around midnight, climb to the balcony, continue to the south summit, pass the Hillary Step, reach the true summit, and descend before afternoon weather systems developed, because on Everest, descent timing is more critical than ascent success, and staying too long at altitude increases the risk of exhaustion, hypoxia, and death. On the night of May 9th and early hours of May 10th, departures were delayed as oxygen systems were checked, clients moved slowly, and teams waited for coordination on the fixed lines, and from the beginning, the ascent schedule began slipping behind the planned timeline. As climbers moved upward, multiple expeditions converged on the same narrow rope sections, creating human bottlenecks where movement stopped completely, forcing climbers to stand still in sub-zero temperatures while consuming oxygen and losing body heat. At several critical points, fixed ropes that were supposed to be installed in advance were missing, forcing guides to stop and rig lines at extreme altitude, causing further delays in exposed sections where climbers were immobilized in the cold. By the time the teams reached the balcony, oxygen consumption was already higher than planned, and safety margins for descent were shrinking. Despite these delays, climbers continued upward, driven by proximity to the summit, financial investment, physical exhaustion from weeks of preparation, and the psychological pressure of not turning back after reaching such altitude. As they advanced toward the south summit, congestion intensified, and climbers from different expeditions became interdependent, sharing rope systems and movement corridors, which removed operational independence and increased systemic risk. The Hillary Step, one of the most technically constricted points near the summit, became a prolonged traffic jam where climbers had to wait their turn to ascend and descend a single rope line, turning a short technical section into a prolonged exposure zone. By late morning and early afternoon, climbers were still ascending when they should already have been descending according to safety protocols, violating turnaround times designed to keep climbers out of the death zone during deteriorating weather conditions. Several climbers reached the summit late in the day, including clients from the main commercial teams, and each late summit success increased the risk of survival because it delayed descent into worsening conditions. As descent began, environmental conditions shifted rapidly, with increasing winds, falling temperatures, thickening cloud cover, and snowfall reducing visibility along the route. The storm system developed faster and stronger than predicted, turning the upper mountain into a whiteout environment where visual navigation became almost impossible. Fixed ropes were increasingly buried under snow, landmarks disappeared, and climbers struggled to identify the correct descent line. Oxygen supplies began running critically low for multiple climbers due to earlier delays and higher than planned consumption, forcing some to descend without supplemental oxygen in the death zone, where judgment, coordination, and strength deteriorate rapidly. Scott Fisher became severely weakened during descent, suffering from exhaustion and altitude-related illness, and eventually became stranded high on the mountain near the balcony area, where rescue attempts failed due to weather conditions, darkness, and physical exhaustion of rescuers. Rob Hall remained high on the ridge near the south summit, assisting Doug Hansen, a client who was struggling to descend, and as conditions worsened, Hall became trapped above Camp 4 with limited oxygen and no safe descent route. Other climbers became disoriented in the storm, drifting away from the main route in whiteout conditions, unable to locate fixed lines or camp lights, and several collapsed from exposure and exhaustion in open terrain between the south summit and the south col. Rescue attempts were launched from Camp 4 as climbers left the relative safety of tents and oxygen supplies to search blindly in the storm for missing teammates, navigating by memory and instinct rather than visibility, exposing themselves to extreme risk. Some climbers were found and brought back to camp in critical condition, while others could not be located. Throughout the night, the storm continued to trap climbers on the upper slopes, preventing coordinated rescue operations and isolating individuals across different sections of the mountain. By the morning of May 11th, the scale of the disaster became clear, as multiple climbers from different expeditions had died on the upper slopes of Everest, including Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, along with several clients and independent climbers, making it one of the deadliest single-day events in Everest's history at that time. The disaster was not caused by a single failure or a single decision, but by a chain of documented factors: overcrowding on the route, delayed departures, missing fixed ropes, oxygen logistics failures, late summit times, deteriorating weather, and the physiological limits of the human body at extreme altitude. These elements converged within a narrow time window, transforming what was planned as a controlled commercial summit operation into a fragmented survival scenario spread across kilometers of exposed ridge, ice slopes, and high-altitude camps. The mountain did not collapse, and there was no single catastrophic physical event, but cumulative pressure from environmental conditions and operational decisions turned small problems into irreversible consequences. The structure of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster was defined by progression rather than explosion, by compression rather than chaos, as delays, congestion, and weather combined to trap climbers in the death zone after safe descent windows had closed. By nightfall, climbers were isolated across the upper mountain. Oxygen supplies were depleted, visibility was near zero, temperatures were falling rapidly, and survival depended not on summit success, but on endurance, location, and the ability to find shelter or descent routes in an environment that no longer allowed organized movement. This was the point at which the summit attempt ended and the survival phase began, with climbers no longer operating as coordinated expeditions, but as scattered individuals and small groups, fighting exhaustion, cold, and altitude in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, marking the irreversible transition from expedition logistics to survival reality on Mount Everest, May 11, 1996. As daylight reached the upper slopes of Mount Everest, the survivors who had made it back to Camp 4 at the South Col emerged from their tents into a landscape of scattered oxygen bottles, frozen ropes, abandoned gear, and deep new snow, and the first task was no longer climbing, but accounting for who had not returned from the summit route. Radio communication between camps confirmed multiple missing climbers across the southeast ridge, the south summit, and the upper sections of the Lhotse face, and the situation immediately shifted from expedition operations to emergency survival and evacuation. Guides and Sherpas began reorganizing resources, redistributing oxygen to the most critical patients, providing basic medical aid for frostbite, hypoxia, and exhaustion, and preparing descent routes for those still physically able to move. The storm had destabilized the route, burying fixed ropes, altering visibility, and creating new hazards on the descent lines, making even downward movement extremely dangerous. Climbers began descending in small, staggered groups toward Camp 3 and Camp 2, moving slowly down the Lhotse face, where ice slopes and crevasse zones required constant rope management and coordination, and where exhaustion increased the risk of falls and disorientation. Helicopter rescue was impossible at those altitudes, meaning every evacuation had to be done manually by Sherpas and fellow climbers, carrying, supporting, and guiding injured people through the western Khum and the Khumbu icefall, a process that would take days and expose rescuers to the same lethal risks that had caused the disaster. At lower camps, temporary medical stations were established using tents and limited equipment, where climbers were treated for severe frostbite injuries that would later lead to amputations, altitude-induced pulmonary and cerebral edema, dehydration, and physical collapse caused by prolonged exposure to cold and hypoxia. As survivors reached base camp, information about the disaster spread rapidly through satellite phones and radio transmissions, reaching Kathmandu and international news agencies within hours, transforming the tragedy into a global event. Expedition leaders began formal documentation processes, reconstructing timelines using radio logs, oxygen records, summit times, and movement schedules to establish a factual sequence of events. Families of climbers were notified through official channels. On the upper mountain, recovery operations began when weather conditions allowed, with teams attempting to locate and secure visible bodies along the route, but retrieval efforts were limited by altitude, weather, and physical risk, and several climbers remained on the mountain due to the danger of recovery attempts in the death zone.
These decisions were made not from indifference, but from physical reality, as retrieval missions at extreme altitude carry a high probability of additional fatalities. Fixed ropes were gradually removed, oxygen caches dismantled, and camps deconstructed as expeditions began preparing to withdraw from the mountain. All remaining summit attempts were canceled, and commercial climbing season was effectively terminated due to safety risks, route instability, and the psychological and physical condition of climbers and Sherpa teams. In Kathmandu, Nepalese authorities and international mountaineering organizations began formal reviews of the season, collecting reports from guides, expedition leaders, Sherpas, and independent climbers to build a comprehensive operational record of what had occurred. These reviews focused on documented factors: overcrowding on the route, scheduling overlap between expeditions, rope fixing failures, oxygen logistics, turnaround time violations, and limitations in weather forecasting accuracy. No single triggering event was identified, but instead a convergence of multiple operational and environmental risks was documented. On Everest itself, weather conditions continued to fluctuate, preventing safe re-access to high camps and reinforcing the decision to abandon remaining operations for the season. Survivors continued descending through the Khumbu icefall to lower elevations, where helicopters were finally able to evacuate the most critically injured climbers to hospitals in Kathmandu. Long-term medical outcomes became clear in the following weeks as several survivors underwent amputations due to frostbite, while others faced permanent respiratory and neurological damage caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation and cold exposure. Expedition companies initiated internal reviews of guide-to-client ratios, client screening processes, oxygen provisioning strategies, and emergency response planning. Sherpa teams, who had carried out the most dangerous rescue operations, returned to their communities after suffering losses within their own ranks, reinforcing the human cost of high-altitude commercial climbing beyond the foreign expeditions. By the end of May 1996, base camp was largely dismantled, expeditions departed the region, and the Khumbu Valley returned to seasonal quiet, leaving behind only fixed root scars, abandoned equipment, and physical traces of the tragedy on the upper slopes. The disaster transitioned from an active emergency into a historical event defined by records, investigations, medical outcomes, and institutional change, marking the end of the operational phase of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster and closing the second stage of the story as the mountain returned to silence and the world absorbed the consequences of what had occurred. Late May 1996. The final phase of the Mount Everest disaster unfolded through withdrawal rather than rescue, as the remaining survivors completed their descent from base camp through the Khumbu Valley, moving away from the mountain while medical evacuations, investigations, and dismantling operations continued. Injured climbers were transported to hospitals in Kathmandu, where long-term treatments began for frostbite, amputations, pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, and neurological damage caused by prolonged hypoxia and cold exposure. Bodies that could be recovered were documented and secured when conditions allowed, while others remained on the mountain due to the extreme danger of retrieval in the death zone, where any recovery attempt risked additional fatalities. Expedition companies completed operational reports. Sherpa teams returned to their villages after weeks of rescue work and loss within their own communities, and base camp was fully dismantled, leaving the south side route of Everest closed for the season. Fixed ropes were removed, oxygen caches were dismantled, and the climbing infrastructure that had supported the season disappeared, returning the mountain to isolation and silence. Official investigations continued through documented radio logs, oxygen usage records, movement schedules, and survivor testimonies, forming a factual timeline of decisions, delays, congestion, and environmental escalation that defined the disaster. Regulatory discussions followed within Nepalese authorities and international mountaineering organizations regarding safety standards, expedition management, route coordination, and commercial climbing structures, but the season itself had already ended. What remained were records, medical recoveries, permanent injuries, unanswered questions, and the physical traces left on the upper slopes of Everest. The 1996 disaster concluded not with a single defining moment, but with a gradual dispersal of people, camps, equipment, and attention as expeditions withdrew, investigations closed, and the mountain returned to its natural state. This was the real ending of the tragedy. Evacuation flights, hospital corridors, written reports, dismantled camps, and the quiet departure of climbers from the Himalayas, not ceremony, not spectacle, and not celebration. Thank you for watching this video. If this story helped you understand the real sequence of events of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment with your thoughts about the story. Your support helps keep these real historical narratives alive and allows the channel to continue producing factual storytelling about extreme environments and human survival.